Tonight, we're going to continue diving into the Gospel of John. There are these different I am statements. Jesus says, I am the resurrection. He says that I am the true vine. He says, I am the bread of life. Shout out to Donovan last week. He did a great job with that. Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. But tonight, we are diving into this Jesus who calls himself the light of the world. These songs that we just sang, we talked about how Jesus has shown up in life and how we are weak, but he is strong. The things that we sing are things that I've begun to live because Jesus is alive in me, and it is so amazing the changes that he's made. So we want you to be able to engage with this. Tonight, we're going to talk about several things. So here's kind of an outline of where we're going. We're talking about why we need Jesus' light. If we don't know why we need it, then we're not going to be looking for it. We think that we're good on our own. We're going to talk about how Jesus shines his light. We're going to talk about how we see his light. And then finally, we're going to get into how the light of Jesus can shine into our lives in the most mundane and regular things. So first off, we're getting into why we need the light. I have a few stories I wanted to share with you tonight. The first is a story about a man named Mustafa. About a month ago, there is that earthquake in Turkey and Syria, which you guys all heard about. It has killed thousands upon thousands of people and has devastated the lives of so many more. But he talks about being trapped in darkness under rubble alongside his wife and 3 children for more than 22 hours. And after 22 hours, his kids see a light. And Mustafa says, my kids start shouting, Daddy, Daddy, light. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Being trapped under thousands, perhaps millions of pounds of twisted steel and concrete, not at all sure if anyone's going to find you, not at all sure if you're going to make it. Darkness is a common and it's a tragic human experience. Darkness can be circumstantial. It can be natural disasters like Mustafa and his family experienced. It can be war like so many are experiencing in a number of places in the world, including Ukraine. It can be just grief and loss. It can be trauma and shock. Darkness can be relational, can be emotional. I've walked through the darkness of anger. I've walked through the darkness of doubt and wondering, do I really have a relationship with Christ? Some experience darkness in the form of unrelenting loneliness. They feel so isolated. They're around people all the time and they have all sorts of conversations, but they don't seem to get any depth and they're left feeling lonely at the end of every day. Some have clinical depression. Some have an overwhelming anxiety that just feels crushing to them. What kinds of darkness have you experienced? One of the stories I wanted to share with you tonight was Derek's story. This is not Jess's Derek, and that's probably not how you spell his name, is it, Derek? But one of the students that I taught while working as a school teacher in Philadelphia, he was a young African-American student who came into my 9th grade math class, and he was silent, but in a very odd way. It was just like the silence that enveloped and engulfed him. It wasn't at all normal, and he would put his head down on his desk any chance that he got. He was new to the school building as a freshman, and I talked to the other teachers on our teaching team about him and trying to figure out what's going on with him. Do you know what's going on? And within a couple of days, I found out some more about Derek's story. Just 2 months prior, he's sitting on his front porch at home, and his older brother has a full scholarship to a university. I just graduated from the same high school that I was teaching at. And 2 of his brother's friends show up in front of the house. And Derek's waiting for his brother to come outside and hang out with them and whatnot. But it just so happens that these 2 other guys get into an argument. And Derek's brother hears this, and he rushes out, and he tries to make peace between them. One of them pulls out a gun and just pumps the trigger, and who is it that falls to the concrete but Derek's brother right in front of him? He was walking through the loneliness of trauma and shock and grief, and he's walking in darkness every day that he goes to school. Some of you may know somebody in similar kinds of trauma that they are walking through today. Another young woman by the name of Debbie, a campus pastor I know and love, shares the story of the night he is called by a university student. And this student calls him because her roommate, Debbie, is crying and won't come out of the dorm room closet that she is hiding in. And so he is invited over, he comes over and he's speaking with her, with the roommate and with Debbie. And what happens is it comes out that Debbie has been suffering from an eating disorder, and her roommate had just discovered it. And she is so crushed by shame and hopelessness and doesn't feel like this is something that she's going to be able to deal with. Debbie was walking through darkness. What are the kinds of darkness that you're dealing with in your life? You have Mustafa and his family trapped under rebel. You have Derek, who's going through trauma and grief. You have Debbie, who has an eating disorder. These are things that students today continue to go through. Jesus came to a people who were walking in darkness. They were living under oppression. And the prophet Isaiah was looking forward to this. And this is what he says. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. And so Jesus comes to a time when all of his countrymen are being cruelly oppressed by an invading force. And things are not just, things are not fair, things are not right. And they're just looking for someone to come and make sense of what's going on, for someone to listen to them. They're praying and they're wondering, is God hearing me? Have you been praying recently and wondering, God, are you even listening to a word that I'm saying? Do you care? Are you going to be there for me? The way Jesus talks about it is this. He says in John chapter 8, verse 12, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Everyone in this room that I can see, I don't see any of you with a cane or a seeing eye dog. You've all had the gift of eyesight. You know what it is to be in the light. But for somebody who's never walked in the light at all, or if they've been in the dark for days upon days upon days, there's things that it does to you. It messes with your circadian rhythms. It does things to your metabolism. There are so many health issues that we have when we walk in darkness and not in light. And that's not just true physically, it's true emotionally, it's true spiritually. If you're angry all the time, it messes with your mind and the way in which you process normal life situations. If you're sad all the time or you're anxious all the time, it affects the way in which you interact with the world. So why is it we need Jesus' light? Because we live in a dark world. Jesus said we live in a world where there's a lot of trial, there's a lot of trouble, and a lot of tribulation. That's why we need his light. So how does Jesus shine his light? How Jesus, one of his closest friends, the Apostle John, talks about it is this in John chapter 1. He says in verse 4, "In Jesus was life, and the life was the light of men and women. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And if you want to look deeper into that, I would encourage you to look at John chapter 1, verse 5 in as many different English translations as possible, because what you're going to find is there is something going on there between the dark and the light. It doesn't say the same thing in each of those translations. There's something going on there. I would encourage you to check that out. In some translations, it talks about the darkness not being able to understand the light, or the darkness not being able to overwhelm it. And there's several other iterations of that, but check that out. But Jesus comes as bringing this life that we need. It is this life that gives us light. It gives us hope. It gives us so many things. He continues in verses 14 and 17. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. That was verse 9. And verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So most of us don't think in terms of glory. That's not a usual word in our culture. But if you love a certain sport like basketball, or you're watching March Madness and you see an amazing athlete do something, people are just cheering in the whole stadium and everybody is just praising this person. There's a certain glory that that person is experiencing. And when somebody is in the midst of glory, it's like there's this bright spotlight upon them and everybody's rejoicing. Well, Jesus, when he comes to us from God the Father, he comes with this life light that is filled with glory. And he comes full of grace and truth. The law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So how is it that Jesus shines his light into our lives? It's through grace and truth. How many of you have read the Gospel of John, beginning to end, or listened to it? A few of you. I'd encourage you to do that. There's Bible apps that you can listen to a chapter. You don't have to tell anybody else that you're doing it. Just listen to it. And if you hear something that you're not sure you understand, write down the question. Send a text in here. The team would love to hear your questions as you're reading or listening through the Gospel of John. But Jesus is constantly shining his light into the lives of people. In John chapter 1, some people start following Jesus. They want to know more about who he is. And Jesus might not have been having a good day. It doesn't tell us what mood Jesus is in, but he gives them grace and he welcomes them to spend time with them. And he says, yeah, you can hang out with me. And pretty soon afterwards, he has some people following him, but he has other people opposing him. One of the main oppositions to Jesus in the Gospels were the rulers and the leaders of the Jews, called the Jewish ruling council. One of those people was a man by the name of Nicodemus. Nicodemus decides, Jesus, I want to come talk to you. And he's giving him a hard time during the day, and he comes to see him at night. Jesus could have said, Nick, I don't have time for you. I'm tired. I need to sleep. You can talk to me tomorrow. But no, he receives him, he gives him grace, and then he gives him truth. And one of the things that Jesus tells Nicodemus is the most famous Bible verse in the world. What is it? I know some of you know it. What does it say? Okay, so there are vocal ones and there are whispering ones. We could have a whole little thing going on, right? But that is a verse that brings hope to so many. But it wasn't new in the New Testament. Jesus has been doing this a long time. So the Israelites were slaves in what country? Egypt, right? And he gets them out of Egypt. That's grace. And then what he does is he goes before them in a very physical way. It's a pillar of cloud by day, and when the sun shines on the clouds, it's like a bright tower of light. And then by night, it's a pillar of fire. And he's literally leading them along a path by which they can travel and be safe. But the Old Testament writers talk about another way in which Jesus brings light to our lives. How many of you had to make decisions today? Oh my goodness, half of you did not even raise your hands. My goodness. That was a decision, you're right. Well, we make decisions all the time, and one of the reasons Jesus gives us his word is to give us light. Psalm 119, 105, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path, which means that he doesn't show us the end from the beginning. How does Jesus shine his light into our lives? It's through his truth. We need his truth on how to deal with emotions. We need his truth on how to deal with relationships. We need his truth on how to deal with darkness. Remember, I asked you at the beginning what darkness it is that you're dealing with. Maybe you don't have darkness that you're dealing with now, but this is something that you need to think about because you will. At some point, you're going to hit a day where life is just too hard for you. You can't deal with it. You can't cope with it. And if you think about it ahead of time, how am I going to handle that? It's going to do you some good. So what are you going to do to deal with that? And what I am suggesting to you, what I'm urging you, what I'm pleading to you is to let Jesus light in. Now, there's something that we don't usually think about. Light doesn't really do a whole lot of good when our eyes are squeezed shut. We've already made up our minds, Jesus, this is just what I want to do. So the other day I was going down, forget if it was, I might have been 83, and there was this car in front of me. It was just going too slow. So I decided to pass it. But of course, when you decide to pass somebody, they speed up. I wasn't, I try not to speed too much, but, I was only going a few miles an hour above the limit. But as I sped up, they sped up, and I sped up, and they sped up. And then I looked behind me, and there's this line of cars, and I felt like, well, the only way to get ahead is to go like 20, 30 over. And I really sensed the Holy Spirit wanted me to slow down and kind of get behind this other person. I'm not doing that. God, I've already made up my mind. I'm not doing that. So, you just stomp it and you go around. And I passed Gavin. So, no, it wasn't Gavin. Gavin would never speed. Gavin would never speed. He drives slow. So I would never have that problem. But light doesn't do us any good when we keep our eyes shut. So how many times is Jesus shining his light? How many times is he giving you grace? How many times is he urging you to come to him and be forgiven and be accepted, and you just don't have any room for what it is he has to say? In John chapter 8, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world, he ends up getting into an argument with the Jews who are listening to him. They don't like what he's saying. They are definitely not vibing with it. And in John chapter 8, verse 43, Jesus says this, why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. And what he means by that is that you're not listening to me, not because you can't understand the words that I'm saying, but you're not listening to me because you don't like what's being said, and you're just kind of letting it go in one ear and out the other, and it's not going to do you any good. The Greek there, hear, means to hear and really receive what is being said. Now, if you're at all like me, when I was a kid and I was a student, my parents would tell me something I didn't like to hear, that's how I heard, because I did not want to hear it. Or when my teachers were telling me something that I really didn't want to hear, I would do that same sort of a thing. And if you don't learn how to deal with that, it's going to be an issue. This brings up this painting by William Holman Hunt. In 1853, he draws a painting where there is this beautiful door. And on the outside of the door, you kind of see these vines that are there. And Jesus has come to the door, and he wants to come in. But if you look closely at the painting, there is no doorknob on the outside. And when Jesus is shining his light and we don't have room for it, that's the interaction that we're having with Jesus, where he wants to come in, he wants to give us hope, but we say, I don't have room for the things that you want to say to me. The way Jesus engages with this in the book of Revelation is he says this, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. Hearing is a heart issue. It's not a head issue. It's not a mind issue. It's a heart issue. So how is it then that we see Jesus' light? We talked about why we need to see his light. It's dark. We talked about how Jesus shines his light. It's through grace and truth. But how we see his light is very important. Faith happens as we allow the sunrise of Jesus' love to wash over our battered, weary souls. I want you to just let those words soak in for a minute. Faith happens as we allow the sunrise of Jesus' love to wash over our battered, weary souls. Faith isn't a skill. It's not an ability or a talent. Some of you have looked at people and you've said, man, I wish I could have faith like them. Some of you have heard somebody and pray and you thought to yourself, I could never have that kind of faith. Faith is not a skill. It's not a talent or an ability. What faith is, it begins by doubting your doubts, because somewhere inside you have questions or doubts or concerns or anxieties, and you don't tend to ask the same questions or hold those anxieties up to the same level of criticism as you do the character and promises of Jesus. So you've got to start by doubting your doubts. Faith continues by yelling. Anybody can yell. Anybody can ask and cry out for help. When Mustafa and his family were stuck under the rubble, and he says that the light shone, another part of the story, Mustafa said, I grabbed the biggest rock I could find, and I started pounding, and I started yelling, saying, we're here, we're here. And so many of us are walking in darkness, and the light is shining around us, but we don't necessarily want to be rescued. But faith begins by doubting your doubts. It begins by yelling, by looking to Jesus and making this unconditional decision to trust. You're all here in Fusion tonight. That's a good thing. I grew up going to youth groups. One of my friends, my best friends growing up, his name is Josh. He grew up going to youth groups as well. But there was a difference between myself and Josh. So what happened is Josh went through his high school years and his college years is he was living for number one. He was living for himself. He was living for the cars that he drove, the girls he could be around. He was living for the experience of the moment. He was just living life for him. And he got into some pretty dark places. And then he experienced the fact that in spite of his mess, Jesus really loved him. It wasn't that he hadn't heard it before. We've all heard John 3:16. We've heard lots of songs. We've heard lots of sermons. But somehow he let Jesus' love wash over his battered, weary soul. And when he put his faith in Christ, for him it was like a light coming on. I went to his baptism. I got to see some more of those this afternoon. They're always precious. But I went to his baptism and watched him weep as he continued to experience this great love that he had spent over 20 years rejecting. I wish more than anything that I could take a USB drive, plug it into my heart, and upload to that thing the experiences of love and comfort and grace and hope and everything that Jesus has given me, and then take that and give that to each one of you and let you download it. So many of you are singing these songs, and for you, they're ideas. Like they're words that are kind of up there. And you're thinking in your head, do people really experience that? Because that's not my experience. For me, so much of that is my experience. I'm going to read a few statements. And for those of you who have been following Jesus for a while, you're going to hear these statements and you're going to be able to think about specific situations and specific ways in which these are a reality in your life. Others of you are going to hear these statements and you're going to say, yeah, I intellectually agree with that. But you're going to look at your heart and you're going to kind of wonder, man, I'm not sure if I've actually experienced that. The light of Jesus dispels darkness. The light of Jesus brings hope to my despair. The light of Jesus brings amazing comfort to the deepest hurts in our hearts. The light of Jesus brings his embrace to our loneliness. That's a beautiful thing. The light of Jesus brings joy even in the most dreary places of our souls. Jesus' light is his love, and he applies that to me through grace and truth. Jesus is interested in me right now, right where I am, and it's amazing. So I don't really have a lot of time to flesh this last one out too much, so we're going to zoom through it pretty quickly. But Jesus does shine his light into our lives through the most mundane things. Sometimes it's just by doing the right thing. Sometimes it's just by doing the most regular thing. So one day I went to work. Well, big deal. So I was a school teacher at the time. I went to work and I didn't feel like going that day. I felt exhausted, but I remember just going to work because I knew that's what God wanted me to do. And I said, well, God, if you want me to get out of bed, you're going to have to give me the strength to do it. He gave me the strength to get out of bed, and then he gave me the strength to take the next step, So I get into school, and I'm wondering, how am I going to help these 100 and whatever kids who are some of the most emotionally needy people that I know because they were just going through so much trauma like Derek. And so I'm wondering how this is going to work. And then I have this one student named Karan. And he comes up to me first period and he says, Mr. Shank, guess what I brought in for you today? I brought in some Red Bull for you. Because to put it in context, in the school I worked in, metal detectors, security, police, doors chained from the inside, because we had to. It was a survival thing. But they could only come in through one way. And you couldn't even get something like Red Bull in, but he got permission to get it in, and I'm not surprised they let him bring it in. But his whole purpose was bringing it in. He says, Mr. Shank is so chill that I just want him to drink this because I want to see him do backflips off the desk. And he goes on about this. And I'm thinking to myself, and for whatever stupid reason, it cheers me up. And God uses somebody who I'm just a regular person I'm interacting with to shine his light into my life in a way in which I needed that day. I encourage you to check out John chapter 9. you definitely need some time in your small groups. Jesus can use the most mundane things to bring light to your darkness. So in your small groups, it's a bunch of questions I have for you. I'm kind of wondering if there's any of the stories that resonated with you. I'm wondering what is your darkness. I'm wondering which of those things you're experiencing more often in your life, light or darkness. What does it mean for you to open your eyes to the light that Jesus has? There's just a lot of time that you're going to have for that. But before that, we've got another worship song. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, I thank you for these students, Lord. I just ask for your blessing upon them. Lord, you want to shine the light of your love into their hearts in ways that they have not yet experienced. Lord, I want them to have the same joy that I've had. I want them to experience the same peace that I know. Lord, I just want them to have a confidence in your character and a confidence in your word more than in their present experiences or the outcomes of the messy situations which they walk through. Give them a confidence in you and help them, Lord, to experience your light in whole new ways. I thank you for your love for us. In Jesus' name, amen.